Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What legal issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? And what does the film teach us about the law and about the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? Our film today is Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is a 2023 movie starring Cillian Murphy as J. Robert Oppenheimer, the American theoretical physicist known as the father of the atomic bomb, for his role as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory during World War II, which developed the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The film was written and directed by Christopher Nolan, based on the book American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin. The film traces Oppenheimer's early life as a physicist, his rise to world prominence through the Manhattan Project, and his subsequent downfall after being stripped of his security clearance in 1954 due to his alleged past communist sympathies and outspoken criticism of the direction of the nuclear arms race. The cast also includes Emily Blunt as Oppenheimer's wife Kitty, Matt Damon as General Leslie Groves, the director of the Manhattan Project, Robert Downey Jr. as Lewis Strauss, a founding member and later chair of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and rival of Oppenheimer, who helped orchestrate Oppenheimer's downfall, and Florence Pugh as Oppenheimer's lover and former Communist Party member Jean Tatlock. The film has garnered critical acclaim and achieved tremendous box office success. It provides a penetrating insight not only into one of the 20th century's most iconic figures, but also into the swirling political and social forces that surrounded the birth of the atomic age and America's transition from World War II to the Red Scare and the Cold War. With me to discuss this film is Audra Wolfe. Audra is a writer, editor, and historian based in Philadelphia. She has a background in both science, with a BS in chemistry from Purdue University, and in history, with a PhD in history and the sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania. Her scholarly work has focused on the role of science during the Cold War, a period when science held a special place in maintaining and projecting state power. Audra has written a lot about the contemporary intersection of science, history, and politics. She's provided insights on science and the Cold War in two books, Freedom's Laboratory, The Cold War Struggle for the Soul of Science, and Competing with the Soviets, Science, Technology, and the State in Cold War America. Her writing and reviews have appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Science, The New Scientist, LARB, Slate, and the popular history podcast, American History Tellers. Audra's talked about science and power on Freakonomics, PRI's The World, Spycast, Radio Times, and NPR. In addition to her work as a writer and historian, Audra operates an editorial and publishing consulting company, The Outside Reader, that helps writers of serious nonfiction develop their craft. There, she offers both on-site and online publishing workshops. Audra, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Oppenheimer portrays attempts at the regulation of nuclear weapons, pitting those who favored greater transparency and international control, like Oppenheimer and many other scientists, against those who supported rapid and more aggressive development of nuclear weapons as the best deterrent. People like Lewis Strauss and many others. Can you talk a little bit about the debate, how it's portrayed in the film, and some of the larger implications?
Sure. I think the film does a really tremendous job in reinvigorating debates about the bomb's role, both in post-war life, but also as kind of an ongoing concern. These ideas of these debates between Oppenheimer and Einstein about whether the bomb should have been developed in the first place. And in real life, and to a certain extent in the movie as well, one of the central things driving the conflict between Oppenheimer and Strauss was Oppenheimer's original opposition to the H-bomb. One thing the film kind of elides is that once it became clear that the H-bomb was in fact technically possible, Oppenheimer didn't really do a lot to stand in its way. But Oppenheimer was part of a group of scientists who were providing technical advice to the Atomic Energy Commission that advised in 1949 that the hydrogen bomb shouldn't be developed, that it was unclear whether it could work, but even if it were feasible, that there was no way to do it, no way that you could use that weapon that wouldn't constitute genocide. And for that reason alone, that the bomb should not be developed. They offered their opinion as scientists, as advisors, Truman and his colleagues decided to disregard that advice and to proceed with the H-bomb. And this was really the central conflict dividing Strauss and Oppenheimer. Certainly, these questions about the international control of atomic energy were part of that. That was maybe the second most important leg of that stool. And the third, which the film really plays up, is just their personal animosity. Some people just don't get along, and Oppenheimer and Strauss managed to rub each other in every possible wrong way that two men can. But in terms of policy, their main disagreements were really these questions about who should control the bomb, and separately, should the H-bomb be developed? And the question of the H-bomb, it is a question of whether it should have been developed, but the conflict was really, what is the role of the scientist here? Are they just giving advice, or are they making policy? And that fundamental disagreement about what the scientist's role was really drives the conflict of the movie, but it also drove many, many discussions about the role of science in policy advising circles throughout the Cold War, and in many ways into the present.
That's so interesting. In the history of that period where you have the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb, as you describe it, kind of so important, and the film brings that out. In retrospect, it's interesting because we kind of just look at it as like the birth of nuclear age and the rapid rise of nuclear arms. And looking back, it gets kind of lumped together a little bit, but it's kind of so critical, that separation between the atomic bomb and the H-bomb and what it means for nuclear power and whether these bombs would ever be used, whether they ever need to be used.
Yes, and also what it means to have a group of people with such specialized knowledge, what that means for democracy. When you look about debates about the role of science in that period from 1945 through 1953, and really through the Oppenheimer hearings, this was a live debate, a topic of endless essays and bestsellers. It seems like every era has the topic where people are writing big idea books, and these books were just kind of flying off the shelves. I don't know if they were actually flying off the shelves, but they were certainly filling bookstores with titles like Science and Democracy and kind of the role of the scientist. One way that it was discussed, Lee DuBridge, the president of Caltech at the time, had a phrase that put the question in terms of whether scientists should be on tap or on top. And that question really animated just so many of these debates and disagreements.
So the film really does a good job in kind of capturing this relationship and the changing relationship between the role of scientists, relationship between scientists and state power. And you talked about Einstein, Oppenheimer, and Strauss. And also, I think, right, Strauss being more of a politician, a bureaucrat, but of the scientists, you have Einstein, Oppenheimer, and then you have, I guess, Teller. Oppenheimer somewhere seemingly kind of in the middle, right? Kind of pulled in both directions. There's a mix of, personal ambition and principle, but very conflicted about it. I think Einstein having maybe stronger views on one end and then Teller on the other end. I don't know. That's how I saw it in the movie. I don't know if that's accurate.
Within the world of the movie, and I think within the policy circle of scientists who were providing this advice, the two poles of the folks who were most engaged in the debates, who actually had influence. Of course, there were a wider set of views of people who weren't necessarily in the room. But of the folks who were in the room, on the one end, you have people like Hans Bethe and Rabi, and on the other end, you have Ed Teller. And Oppenheimer is somewhere in between there. Once it became clear that there was a good design for the H-bomb, he dropped his resistance to it. In some ways, kind of a pragmatist when it came to what scientists could do. At the same time, I think the film really plays up this idea of Oppenheimer as naive, particularly in terms of his relationships with individuals who are in the Communist Party, just kind of his political judgment generally. But one flavor of Oppenheimer's naivete that the film touches on, doesn't name as much, but in some ways it is the heart of the film, is naivete about what the role of the scientist in the policy discussion was. That Oppenheimer and that group of scientists who signed the appendix to the General Advisory Council recommendation saying that there shouldn't be an H-bomb, they really seemed to think that as the scientists who were giving the advice, that they were the ones who should be listened to, that they had a right to be listened to, that it was their prerogative, their duty. In some cases, some of them felt that they had blood on their hands, but others of them felt that in the balance between democracy and technocracy, that there was a solid argument for technocracy and that their voices should carry more weight than other people's voices should. That's a different kind of naivete, and it certainly comes up in the movie, but Oppenheimer wasn't alone in that misperception about how much authority scientists held at that time.
There's a scene where Oppenheimer and other scientists, some who were opposed to using the nuclear weapon against Japan. They had bought into it for the use against the Nazis, who had been defeated by that point. They meet with Secretary of War Stimson, played by James Remar, and Leslie Grove, played by Matt Damon, and other U.S. officials. And that's where the decision is made, the selection of targets to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there's that line by Stimson saying they want to spare Kyoto because of its cultural importance and the fact that Stimson and his wife had honeymoon there. Apparently that line was ad-libbed by the actor James Remar, although it's, I think, rooted in historical fact. And certainly Kyoto was spared. Let me play this clip for you now.
The firestorm in Tokyo killed 100,000 people, mostly civilians. I worry about an America where we do these things and no one protests.
Pearl Harbor and 3 years of brutal conflict in the Pacific buys a lot of latitude with the American public.
Enough to unleash the atomic bomb?
The A-bomb might not cause as much damage as the Tokyo bombings.
What are we estimating?
In a medium-sized city, 20 or 30,000 dead.
But don't underestimate the psychological impact of an atomic explosion. A pillar of fire, 10,000 feet tall, deadly neutron effects for a mile in all directions from one single device. Dropped from a barely noticed B-29, the atomic bomb will be a terrible revelation of divine power.
If that's true, it would be definitive. World War II would be over. Our boys would come home.
Military targets.
But there aren't any big enough.
Perhaps a vital war plant with workers housed nearby. Now we could issue a warning to reduce civilian casualties.
They'd send everything they have up against us, and I'd be up in that plane. But if we announce it and it fails to go off, we'd scupper any chance of a Japanese surrender.
Is there no way to demonstrate a bomb to Japan to provoke surrender?
We intend to demonstrate it in the most unambiguous terms. Twice. Once to show the weapon's power, and a second to show that we can keep doing this until they surrender.
We have a list of 12 cities to choose from. 11. I've taken Kyoto off the list due to its cultural significance to the Japanese people. Also, my wife and I honeymooned there. It's a magnificent city. Let me make this simple for you, gentlemen. According to my intelligence, which I cannot share with you, the Japanese people will not surrender under any circumstances, short of a successful and total invasion of the home islands. Many lives will be lost, American and Japanese. The use of the atomic bomb on Japanese cities will save lives.
If we retain moral advantage.
How so?
Well, if we use this weapon without informing our allies, they'll see it as a threat, and we'll be in an arms race.
How open can we be with the Soviets?
Secrecy won't stop the Soviets from becoming part of the atomic world.
We've been told they have no uranium.
You've been misinformed. A Russian bomb is a matter of time.
The program needs to continue at full pace after the war.
Secretary Stimson, if I may. Not all scientists on the project are in agreement. In fact, this might be a moment to consider other opinions. If you talk to
The Manhattan
scientists...
Project has been plagued from the start by certain scientists of doubtful discretion and uncertain loyalty. One of them just tried to meet with the president. Now, we need these men, but as soon as it's practical, we should sever any such scientists from the program. Wouldn't you agree, Doctor?
If a Russian bomb is inevitable, perhaps we should invite their top scientists to Trinity.
President Truman has no intention of raising expectations that Stalin be included in the atomic project.
Informing him of our breakthrough and presenting it as a means to win the war need not make unkeepable promises. But the Potsdam Peace Conference in July will be President Truman's last chance to have that conversation. Can you give us a working bomb by then?
Absolutely. We will test fire before the conference.
This is, I think, an important scene for many reasons. Debates about the necessity of the bomb, goal versus the number of casualties, the feasibility of warnings, and then the desire to send a message to the Soviets before Potsdam in light of the looming Cold War. Oppenheimer is, as you've kind of described, conflicted, but ultimately supports it. Is there anything else that we can tease out of this scene about the relationship between science and the military in this period?
I'm not sure that the scene tells us a lot about science in the military, but I think it does provide some insights into how Nolan wants us to understand the question of the bomb's use. There is a question in the scholarship on the dropping of the bomb. The question used to be, whose decision was this? Why did Truman want to do this? This question of, would a test have been sufficient, et cetera, et cetera. But in the past 20 years or so, that debate has really shifted to the question of whether there was a decision at all. or whether, given the extent of firebombing in Japan, whether the military brass really saw this weapon as different in kind from anything else that they had been using. World War II was a devastating war in Europe and Japan. It was just an absolutely devastating war. And everyone involved by that point in the war was fairly dedicated to using any tools at their disposal to win and or end the war. The United States and its allies had invested extraordinary sums of money in this weapon. They had also invested extraordinary sums of money in some other scientific weapons, scientific and technical weapons as well, including radar and the proximity fuse in particular. But the scale of the research on the bomb, the scale of the investment was unprecedented. So on the one hand, yes, there was this argument from some of the scientists that there might have been a test demonstration, and there were debates about where specifically the bomb should be dropped. But in the end, the first two bombs didn't require presidential authorization in the ways that we think about atomic warfare or atomic weapons requiring today. They had not yet obtained a special status as a different kind of weapon. Nolan, I think, is portraying it very much as this. It is a different kind of weapon, and historically it was a new and terrifying kind of weapon. But in the immediate context of that conflict, it didn't seem so different from the scale of destruction that was being rained down on other major cities full of civilians at the time.
Yeah, I mean, and the scene they talk about that the casualties would be fewer potentially than what had happened in the firebombing of Tokyo or of Dresden. So to your point, there is that sense of not knowing, and very interesting too about the regulation. Truman made the decision, but I think what you're saying is that the fact that Truman made it was more a matter of policy or politics than a legal requirement at the time.
Yes. And there wasn't, for instance, a specific launch code or the idea that the pilots could change targets if they needed to, as they did. So the procedure of dropping it was simply different than the rules that were established later on, particularly once the United States was not the only country that had a nuclear weapon, because the consequences of using one would be different. There are some other interesting things happening in that scene, though. So on the one hand, some of the military brass are saying we can't use this because of secrecy, that it would be revealing too much if we reveal that we have this weapon. Whereas some of the scientists in the room, particularly Oppenheimer, are pushing the idea that there would not be a secret once the bomb was used, period, that there would be nothing to hide, that the bomb itself was not, in the grand scheme of things, as difficult to engineer as one might think, that it was a feat of engineering, but the actual concepts of how you put together a bomb are relatively straightforward, at least if you're a theoretical physicist, and that the main question was, would such a device work in the first place? And so for Oppenheimer, that scene is pointing ahead to some other questions about how much secrecy there should be later. And Oppenheimer was in a camp that said, there's no point, there's nothing to hide here. Some of the other people in the room, Groves in particular, seem very confident that no one else will have a bomb in the near future, even if they know that secret. And that's because of something that is hinted at the movie, but never actually explained, which was that General Groves had bought up what he thought to be the vast majority of the world's supplies of uranium. Circa 1945, he turned out to be wrong about that. That was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union was able to test an atomic weapon as soon as it did, because it had more access to uranium from new stores that the United States wasn't aware of. But Groves actually kind of raises an eyebrow, or the actor playing Groves raises an eyebrow, and he does it again in another scene where there's kind of an implicit discussion of how soon the Soviets can get the bomb. And Groves and Truman are pretty sure it's going to be a while, because they know that in their minds, there's no more uranium to be had. They turned out, like I said, to be a little wrong about that.
So interesting. And, you can potentially critique some of the scientists who are opposing the bomb or calling for international control as the best way to prevent its spread as potentially naive, but they were pretty clearly right. As they basically said, Russia's got really good scientists. They're going to have a bomb and it's not going to be long. And it was the US military, the notion that they would have this very powerful, awesome tool to themselves, who were a little bit naive on that score.
Yeah, and I think they would actually double down on that naivete in 46 and 47 for some reasons that have nothing to do with the bomb, but actually have to do with Hitler and German science. And it has to do with formations of how Americans were understanding the nature of science and its relationship to democracy after the war. When the conflict was winding down in Europe, the United States sent a team as part of various scientific intelligence collection efforts to try and understand why the Germans had made so little progress on developing a bomb. And there were a lot of reasons to that, but the report that they wrote partially landed on ideology. That because German scientists had either been eliminated from their post or had left the country or were killed in other ways, they weren't involved in the bomb project. And that idea of having a racial and ideological purity in terms of the science of the bomb limited their ability to develop it. They also felt that there was a sense of personal loyalty to some of the actors involved, Heisenberg, that was not helpful and that was limiting scientists' ability to generate new ideas. So part of how they interpreted the German bomb experience kind of was built into these ideas of the special ways that science supposedly worked in the United States, that scientists weren't subject to military control, they weren't subject to government control, that they had a different kind of freedom of thought, and that that freedom of thought was essential to how the United States had won the war. And it was true that the idea for this bomb came from scientists, and that when the military first heard about it, they drugged their feet. That it was people like Leo Szilard and Einstein and Vannevar Bush who were ultimately pushing to say, this is a thing that we need to do, that was not coming from military leaders. And so, in 1945, the United States was trying to understand this in terms of what had happened in Nazi Germany. But as the Cold War was becoming a stronger conflict, as the United States was trying to understand the nature of its conflict with the Soviet Union, they really came to see it as this ideological and even psychological conflict. And they kind of caricatured some of these ideas about how science would work in the Soviet Union. And so they assumed that, as had happened in Nazi Germany, that there would be kind of ideological lines and that scientists who didn't have certain ideas about physics, in this case, that would follow Marxist thought, might be excluded from the project and that the Soviet bomb project would falter. They were wrong about that. Actually, it turned out that in the Soviet Union, that getting a bomb to work was much more important than participating scientists' ideas about dialectical materialism. That just wasn't the most pressing issue. They wanted a working bomb. And of course, the Soviets also had access to, they had inside information to what had happened at the Manhattan Project that helped. And they had also seen that the bomb worked. As Oppenheimer and his colleagues pointed out, once you know it works, you know the most important thing. So then they just had to do it.
You had all the scientists who came over at some point from Germany, right, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe because of the Nazi regime and what it was doing, who contributed to the building of the atomic bomb. But in Russia, they had their reservoir reserve of scientists, and they made it a priority of the state. It's interesting because, as you suggested, it was Germany, right, and Heisenberg that the scientists, Oppenheimer and the others, thought were ahead of the United States, and they were racing to catch up with Germany. I think the movie does a good job of portraying that, how very quickly Germany wasn't the focus anymore. Really, very quickly, and well before the bomb was dropped, was Russia.
And I think for people who have come of age after the Cold War ended, after the Berlin Wall fell, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that is really hard to keep track of. And I know certainly when I've spoken to undergraduates, this idea that the Soviet Union was one of the United States' allies, albeit a complicated ally, but an ally in the war, is really hard to wrap your head around, given the way that the conflict changed so quickly thereafter.
And that all gets tied up into a lot of the security issues, which you can move to in a minute, in terms of why there was this support for or sympathy for the Soviet Union. I mean, it has to do with support for leftist causes, particularly in the 30s, but also the fact that even during the war, the Soviet Union was our ally. So why not share? And I think the film does a kind of really good job of navigating some of those questions and the very different views that a lot of people in the military establishment had. The film talks about FBI surveillance of Oppenheimer and other scientists. How significant was this surveillance? And have you come across examples in your work suggesting the impact or the types of things that are in these sort of FBI files that were gathered and the way it impacted scientists during the Cold War?
So Oppenheimer is an extreme case. And I think it's important for viewers of the film and for listeners to understand that there were, certainly some scientists to whom this kind of surveillance happened. But at least if Oppenheimer's biographers, Bird and Martin Sherwin, are to be believed, and there's no reason not to believe them. Their book, American Prometheus, is an amazingly thorough book on Oppenheimer's life. The specifics of the FBI's surveillance of Oppenheimer was requested by Strauss. This wasn't a case where J. Edgar Hoover was saying, let's go out and surveil Oppenheimer. This is a case where Strauss is saying, you need to put Oppenheimer under constant surveillance. Now, that isn't to minimize the effects of the surveillance on Oppenheimer and Kitty Oppenheimer's life and their friends' lives. They were searching Kitty Oppenheimer's parents' luggage when she traveled. Even after the hearing, when the Oppenheimers went to take a vacation in St. John's in the US Virgin Islands, they were being surveilled there. They had installed bugs underneath photographs and framed pictures in the homes of their friends if they knew they were going to be visiting. The surveillance was constant. It was making them both incredibly anxious. It was oppressive. And this did happen to some other scientists, particularly ones who had known communist affiliations. And there were other scientists who lost various kinds of credentials or who had troubles getting their security clearances. A very famous example that only comes up in passing in the movie but is relevant involved Ed Condon, who had been also very involved in the bomb project and in post-war work. He had been at the Bureau of Standards. And Ed Condon couldn't keep his clearance and eventually ended up leaving government to work in the private sector, but then also needed a clearance there. And so that was challenging. Linus Pauling famously couldn't get his passport. Now, what's interesting about all of these cases, though, are that no one's going to jail. People are having trouble getting their clearances, and sometimes people are having trouble with their passports. And the passport one, I think, is, to my mind, a more serious, a more egregious issue than not getting a clearance. For the majority of these scientists whose stories we know and whose stories we tell, when they're having trouble with red baiting, it often is in terms of threats of being called before UAC. It's in terms of university departments who are unwilling to renew their teaching appointment. It's kinds of blacklisting. But most of the time, and this is happening less now because most of them have passed on, given the passage of time and generations. But when a lot of these debates and conversations looking back on, say, Oppenheimer's role in the 90s and 2000s were still happening, some of these scientists were still alive, and they would request their FBI files. And you would hear stories from people who, in retrospect, were fairly mainstream characters, pointing out the fact that they requested their own FBI file, and it was hundreds and hundreds of pages long. Now, I have seen some of these FBI files because I too have requested them after hearing these stories. One of them is the file of a man named Bentley Glass, who plays a big role in my second book, Freedom's Laboratory. Glass had a fairly national reputation. He refused to sign loyalty oaths. And he became a figure who was often grouped in conversations with Linus Pauling for his unwillingness to sign loyalty oaths and the trouble that that was getting him into in some policy corners. But Glass had a high clearance, and Glass was doing a lot of international work on behalf of the government. He was also the head of any number of professional organizations, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And eventually he became the provost at Stony Brook. I mean, this was not a man whose career suffered too much because he refused to sign this loyalty oath. And so when you see these FBI files that are hundreds of pages long for scientists who were involved in policy discussions during this time period, often it's just standard background checks because they need to re-up their security thing. That doesn't mean there aren't ridiculous things in the files. Glass was a very kind of moderate, let's call him a white racial moderate for that time period. You know, he gave $5 to some interracial student group, and that would show up on his FBI files for 20 years. The group that he gave money to was supposedly a fellow traveler group. And so every time he needed to renew his security classification, they had questions about the $5 that he had given to this interracial youth group. What I'm saying is not a defense of the FBI. I mean, Hoover's FBI was doing atrocious things that they should not have been doing. At the same time, it is also very true that many of the scientists who had clearances, who participated in these discussions during these times, that some of them have felt it in their interest to suggest that they had a more oppositional stance to the government, maybe than they actually did when they were doing things like advising on the development of weapons. That if their chief complaint was that they couldn't simultaneously give speeches about the dangers of fallout and advise the government on how to develop a bomb, I mean, I think it's useful for us to reflect on what exactly they're complaining about here and in what ways their rights have been infringed.
Such an interesting history the film just kind of touches on. A central aspect in the film, like you mentioned, is the revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance, which is, the film makes clear, kind of a political maneuver orchestrated by Strauss. The decision of the Atomic Energy Commission on the appeal, I think, is issued like a day before the commission was going to expire anyway, was to make a point. What else can you tell us about the background of the proceeding and what the actual accusations were against Oppenheimer, who had been such a celebrated, prominent figure for his role in the Manhattan Project?
I want to start answering that question by drawing listeners' attention to the word proceeding, kind of what kind of incident this was. I don't think it'll be a surprise to your listeners that you and I corresponded a little bit before we talked about what we were going to talk about. This is what normally happens in podcasts. And I noticed when I was looking at what you wanted to talk about that you referred to it as a trial.
A political trial.
Right, a political trial. But it was not a trial, right?
Oh.
This was an administrative hearing within the AEC about whether Oppenheimer's security clearance, and technically it was appealed. Technically it had already been revoked a few months earlier. And so this was a hearing to see whether it would be reinstated. And that difference matters a lot for what actually happened, both in terms of how they justified it at the time. Now, the morality and ethics of what they were doing may be a separate question, but it is important to understand that this was not a trial in the criminal sense, or even a civil trial. This was a proceeding in which the AEC had elected to rescind his clearance in December. So this hearing was in response to the idea that Oppenheimer's security clearance had been removed in December. And this was in response to some actions that Strauss had taken. And Eisenhower wanted there to be what he called a blank wall between Oppenheimer and all security information. In terms of what Oppenheimer was actually doing at this time, he was a consultant. He wasn't working for the AEC on a regular basis. According to some accounts, the AEC had actually only called on him for a total of 6 days in the past 2 years. So if they had concerns about Oppenheimer, one way to approach the problem was simply not to ask him for help. And most of the body of most of the charges against him were things that the AEC had previously considered many, many times. These questions about his personal relationships with people who were communists before he met them, were communists when he was with them. The question of whether he himself was a communist, something called the Chevalier affair, which is very complicated, and we don't need to get into the weeds. And let's assume that everyone listening has seen the movie. Maybe you've encountered the Chevalier affair. The real impetus for why this was coming to a head had to do with Eisenhower's election, which meant a change in parties, that we went from a Democrat in the White House to a Republican in the White House. And so Eisenhower was appointing a new head of the AEC, and that new head was Lewis Strauss, who, as we have established, did not get along with Oppenheimer. At the same time, there was a policy debate happening about how frank the government needed to be with the American people about the dangers of atomic weapons. All of these things that I've said earlier about these debates about the H-bomb, it's so essential to know that all of that was happening in secret. Basically, everything about nuclear weapons policy was happening in secret. No one could talk about any of it. And so Oppenheimer had been part of a group of scientists who not only had been wanting international control of atomic energy, but they had been asking for what they called candor. And this actually became a name within the administration, Operation Candor, the question of how frank the administration should be about this. And so Oppenheimer gave a speech to the Council of Foreign Relations that Strauss in particular found deeply upsetting and inappropriate. But again, part of what Oppenheimer was doing that was kind of pressing Strauss's buttons was Oppenheimer wasn't just saying, here's what I know about theoretical physics. Oppenheimer was saying, here is what you, the government, here is how you should conduct your atomic policy. And for hawks like Strauss, this was inappropriate and a sign that the scientists, who he didn't trust in the first place, were overstepping their bounds. And so that was the straw that broke the camel's back for Strauss. And it led to this issue with the hearing. And so then Oppenheimer had a choice. Strauss was hoping that Oppenheimer would simply resign. And actually, that's also what Einstein told him to do, that he should simply resign, that he didn't need this in his life, that he could simply walk away from this. Why did he want to be part of an operation that he thought was terrible anyway? But Oppenheimer felt that it was important that he clear his name. And so he decided to fight the charges. And that is the administrative hearing that we see represented in the movie.
It's so important that it is not a trial, right? A political trial, it's a trial like Joan of Arc, it's a show trial. The film, in fact, it opens, I think in the opening moments of the film saying, it might be Oppenheimer, someone refers to a trial and someone says during the hearing, this is not a trial. Forget about a criminal trial. It doesn't have anything resembles to a civil trial or even kind of a modern administrative hearing with basic elements of due process. There was evidence that Oppenheimer's counsel never got to see that was presented, a limited ability to call or cross-examine witnesses, a lack of impartiality. I mean, a host of reasons that led one character in the film to refer to it as kind of a kangaroo court.
Yes, there is no question that Strauss stacked this deck. As the head of the AAC, Strauss picked the members of the panel and then was able to influence then how the panel's recommendations came to the rest of the commissioners. But one of the most important ways that Oppenheimer didn't receive the rights of a person who was on a different kind of trial. So a lot of what the prosecution had at their fingertips and what the judges on the administrative panel had, they had access to all of these, I think fair to say, illegal FBI wiretaps and surveillance of Oppenheimer. And they had other information from during the Manhattan Project that was considered classified. Oppenheimer's legal team didn't have a clearance. And so the prosecutor and the judges had access to vast troves of evidence that Oppenheimer and his legal team were not allowed to see. They couldn't know who the witnesses were going to be beforehand. Just any number of issues that were fairly egregious in terms of due process. One can also question the wisdom of Oppenheimer's counsel approach. His lead counsel was Lloyd Garrison, who did not particularly, who wanted to really demonstrate Oppenheimer's cooperative, that he was cooperating and that he was reasonable. In retrospect, that was no match for Strauss's desire to humiliate Oppenheimer in any possible way that he could.
Or Rob, the prosecuting attorney, who was extremely effective and was an important right-wing figure. Although I learned in preparing for the podcast, he represented Earl Browder. I don't know if you knew, early in his career, the head of the Communist Party, which I thought was kind of interesting. So, I mean, he later shifted. Nixon put him on the DC circuit, but he did a very effective. He was very effective in trying to demolish Oppenheimer. I mean, the only one, at least according to the film, who really seemed to have any effect in pushing back was Kitty during his cross-examination of her, but he seemed to otherwise get kind of the best of everybody.
Absolutely. Even Leslie Groves, who came hoping to support Oppenheimer and managed to find himself backed into a corner. I think the prosecutor was very skilled, and the scientists in particular, I think, weren't really prepared to be treated that way, which was enlightening to many of them. And that is touched on a little bit in the film, but the question of Oppenheimer's legacy and what happened to Oppenheimer afterwards is an interesting one in that, reasonable people can disagree about whether Oppenheimer was destroyed by what happened at the hearing. He lost his clearance. He was no longer consulting for the AAC. He remained at the helm of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies for the rest of his career and very much became an intellectual celebrity. Even did kind of international work representing the face of American scientists as a figure going abroad for the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a CIA-backed group that was kind of promoting American values abroad. So yes, Oppenheimer lost his clearance. He would never be involved in defense consulting in the same way. Was he ostracized from his professional life? Was Oppenheimer truly canceled? In my heart of hearts, I do not believe that Oppenheimer was canceled. But yes, he lost his clearance.
He lost his clearance, although he was sort of getting frozen out anyway. They just weren't calling him to consult as much. And I mean, I think, why he decides to participate, I don't know, but the film seems to suggest, I think later on, that he wanted to kind of make himself a martyr. And ultimately, he certainly was resurrected later. In December 2022, Jennifer Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, the head of the successor to the AEC, vacates the 1954 revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance. So he gets this kind of posthumous validation. But even during his lifetime, as you said, he still was this prominent intellectual figure and garnered a certain degree of sympathy. So at the end of the day, all he lost was his clearance. Not to kind of justify the result, but the consequences were, practically speaking, maybe not that great.
Yes, I found Granholm's decision to do this in 2022 so interesting because the federal government had in some ways already apologized when he was awarded the Fermi Award in December 1963, which Oppenheimer was expecting to receive from Kennedy, but of course Kennedy was killed a few weeks earlier. He did receive that from Johnson. I believe, if I'm not misrecalling, this is in the movie where he gets this award from Johnson. So it's less than a decade later, he's back in the White House getting the same award that Ed Teller, of all people, had received the previous year. So I think Oppenheimer's ostracism is greatly overstated, at least in my opinion. Clearly, it was very personally upsetting to him and Kitty. It was devastating on a personal psychological basis. I have no question about that. But why he chose to fight it, in the first place, it is absolutely true that Oppenheimer's political judgment and sense of his own importance, the man had a high belief in his own abilities to get out of any problem. Whether he wanted to fight it thinking that he was going to be a martyr or whether he wanted to fight it thinking that he could actually win, I think is an open question. I cannot hazard what went on inside the mind of J. Robert Oppenheimer. But it is clear that there were a few challenges that he had not overcome thus far in his life. And I think some part of him probably looked forward to the idea of showing Strauss that he was wrong.
We have the consequences for Oppenheimer and what that meant to someone who was father of the atomic bomb, such a celebrated, iconic figure, and what that meant for the country to kind of do that to him through revocation of the security clearance. But the larger implications, it's seen as kind of like when you look at Cold War history, I'm not anywhere nearly as immersed in it as an expert like yourself, but this is kind of one of those seminal moments when you're talking about what happens in America's shift into the Cold War, what happens with Oppenheimer and the hearing or political trial and the revocation of the clearance. The larger significance socially, culturally, and for scientists.
It's so hard to separate what happened with scientists' authority and the question of the bomb vis-a-vis Oppenheimer, vis-a-vis other things that were happening in 1954. One thing that is not mentioned in the film at all, and it is a fascinating omission, was that the United States had tested its hydrogen bomb in the Castle Bravo test in March of 1954. And this test very famously went terribly wrong. And one of the things that happened was that a Japanese fishing boat got caught in the fallout. Marshall Islanders had to leave their homelands too. At the time that this administrative hearing was taking place, the Japanese fishermen had already returned home, and Japanese fish markets were realizing that they were seeing a lot more radioactivity than they should have in some of the harvest. And there was a great debate about how dangerous this was. And so at the very same moment that Strauss was orchestrating Oppenheimer's downfall, that really changed how scientists understood their relationship to the security apparatus, literally the same month, Strauss was all over the airwaves trying to assure people that fallout was harmless, that there would be no repercussions of this scaled up program of nuclear testing. One of the fishermen died that fall. He lasted through the summer, but he did die that fall. And a debate about the safety of atmospheric nuclear testing was really kicked off not so much by the test itself, but by Strauss's insistence that it was harmless and the clear evidence that it was not harmless. There were so many US servicemen and so many Marshallese and the Japanese fishermen who had been exposed during that test and who saw the dangers of that test, that test really sparked off a conversation about the safety of atomic testing, the biological dangers, the environmental dangers, so much so that there were periods in the late 1950s and early 60s where there were brief moratoriums on atmospheric testing. And this ultimately culminated in 1963 in the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which barred testing of atomic weapons in space, in the atmosphere, and in the water. So parties that were signature to that agreement moved that underground. So that debate was really kicking off at the same time that this hearing was taking place. And when we follow the trajectories of these scientists over the next few years, that debate is what we keep coming back to. There was very famous televised debates between Pauling and Teller about the biological effects of atomic radiation, with Pauling saying, people aren't giving their consent, they're being exposed to this. And Teller saying the dangers of exposure to fallout are so minimal compared to the dangers of communism, that it's worth it. We have to do this no matter what. So that's a very long way of saying that the contours of that debate were changing really rapidly in 1954. And it was becoming much more apparent to everyone that this was no longer just a question of scientific authority and what the scientists knew, but these were political questions about kind of what should be tested, putting even aside the question of how these weapons could be used. How could you even test them without the consent of people on the globe everywhere who were going to be exposed to these weapons? And many, many scientists chose to participate in that debate, even as they were often advising the AEC. So it was a very complicated period, but that month of April 1954 was really when all of this was coming to a head and scientists were beginning to understand how much more complicated their role in this process really was.
It's such an interesting history and element of this. And so there are multiple things kind of going on at the same time. Just to go back to the hearing, you mentioned Leslie Groves, who I think you had said kind of came up to help Oppenheimer. And, I don't know how accurate it is, but the film demonstrates or portrays this kind of slightly antagonistic, but overall kind of amicable role. They at least work together well, Groves and Oppenheimer. Groves managed to see Oppenheimer's talents, and Oppenheimer, I think, recognized some sense that Groves, had good judgment in some areas. But under the cross-examination, there are some questions posed by Rob to Groves about Oppenheimer's loyalties, sympathies, his view on the H-bomb, and whether he should still maintain a clearance. And at the end, Leslie Groves, played very effectively by Matt Damon, says, well, Oppenheimer's not disloyal, but under the security criteria that are in effect today, he acknowledges he wouldn't clear Oppenheimer, wouldn't have cleared any of those guys, scientists. Can you tell us a little bit more about the relationship between the two and Groves at the hearing and Leslie Groves generally? Because he's a really interesting figure.
Yeah, I hadn't expected to come away from that movie feeling so sympathetic to Leslie Groves. But in some ways, the movie portrays Groves as the most clear-eyed person involved in the project. No delusions that they could simply develop a bomb and then treat it as an intellectual exercise, that if they were going to do this kind of thing, of course, it would be used. A real sense of the limits of their political power. That moment of the hearing is, in some ways, the first time that we see Groves taking any kind of political misstep in the whole film. Groves was a fairly brilliant political actor and administrator in that sense. He put up with a lot from Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer clearly wanted to treat many parts of the Manhattan Project like a university department in the midst of a war, in the midst of doing this deeply scientific project. So when various members of the panel said that they had real questions about Oppenheimer's judgment, from the light of history, I'm not sure that's a bad assessment, that Oppenheimer repeatedly was. And the problem with the people he was talking to, it wasn't that they were communists. That wasn't the problem, because one can hold any number of political beliefs. The problem was that some of them were actively passing on information and made that clear to Oppenheimer. And he still felt that it would be fine to have them working on the project. That, I think, reasonable people can say is probably an error of judgment. And when we look at the ways that he was trying to orchestrate scientists' influence over the question of the H-bomb, he did misread the scientists' amount of power, and in many ways seemed to feel that if they gave scientific advice, that their advice would be followed. And that's not, scientific advice is important. It is essential for any number of decisions in a democracy, but scientists aren't necessarily the ones making those decisions. So Oppenheimer has a history of doing this kind of thing. Whereas Groves understands the parameter of a project, he understands its budget, and Groves is very dedicated to getting a project done on time. It's no coincidence that he built the Pentagon. This is what the man is known for. He's known for getting things done on time and on schedule. But there is this moment in this hearing where he says that using the same standards, that none of the men would have been allowed on the project. And I think the film does a really good job of conveying, how widespread support was on the left in the 1930s for either the Communist Party or just short of the Communist Party for leftist causes, that this was absolutely a mainstream thing, in 1936, especially in a university faculty, that Oppenheimer was not alone in doing that. That there are actually even characters in this film who had personal relationships with people who went off to fight in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, leftist politics were just kind of a part of their lives. And this continued to be an issue for the United States to figure out how to navigate into the 50s, particularly when trying to build relationships with intellectuals in Europe, like in France. The number of French intellectuals who either had been or were still members of the Communist Party was quite high, and the United States was going to need to find ways to work with them in ways that Congress often found difficult to understand. There were a lot of consequences of that in terms of what the United States could and couldn't do for scientific intelligence. But that's not the question you asked me. You asked me about Leslie Groves. So I'll just say that the problem of what to do about scientists who also had leftist affiliations was a live one circa 1953 and will continue to be a live one for some time.
The other figure who's really doesn't have a large role in the film, I think that he's depicted, he praises Kitty's testimony response sympathetically, is Henry DeWolf Smith, who dissents. He's the judge who dissents from the decision of the majority. He says they've extended the concept of security risk beyond its legitimate justification. This was a dangerous precedent by misusing the label of security threat to deny the country the services of a person of great talents like Oppenheimer. Is there anything to say about how he ends up on this panel? I mean, it's the only dissent, so I was just kind of curious.
I wish I could tell you about the panel part. That's not something I can speak to. But what I can tell you is that one of the most interesting roles that Smith had in this broader story is that his name is attached to what became known as the Smythe Report, which basically publicized a lot of the workings of the bomb immediately after its usage. Then when the scientists were trying to figure out, when the government was also trying to figure out, like, well, clearly we have to release a statement. How much do we want to say? Smythe's name went on the report that came out. That was, honestly, it's sort of shocking how much material was released. It didn't give specifics of, say, the implosion mechanism, but short of that, it was a very detailed document on the bomb's workings. And that document later became, the question of hindsight for that document when the Soviet Union exploded its own weapon in 1941. That was one of the documents that came up, the question of whether the Soviets even needed spies, given the existence of the Smythe Report. I will say there was another character who I had expected to have a bigger role in the film, and that was Vannevar Bush. I had looked at the cast list before I went to see the movie, and as somebody who's written 2 books on science and the Cold War, I was so excited. There's any number of deep-cut science policy figures were cast by well-known actors in this film. But what's interesting is that they're often not identified. They are deep cuts. And it wasn't until one of the final scenes in the hearing where somebody refers to Dr. Bush, where I'm realizing that there's this man, this older, thin man with glasses. And I slapped the knee of the person I was with at the theater and I said, "That's Vannevar Bush. That's supposed to be Vannevar Bush." And in retrospect, he had been in many of the prior scenes, even some fairly important scenes, for instance, talking about that GAC report advising against the bomb. They're all like at a banquet table, and Lewis Strauss is there too, and there's big flowers on the table, and they're talking about whether they should develop the H-bomb. But so the person who is supposed to be Vannevar Bush is in that scene too. He's at one of the earliest scenes where they come into E.O. Lawrence's lab, and they have to ask Oppenheimer to leave because Oppenheimer hasn't been cleared to join it yet. He's one of the people in the room. But he is never identified by name until that very last scene. So there's a lot of ways in which the film is fairly accurate, I think, to historical reality in many ways. And it's actually more accurate than it might seem at first glance. But you have to have a pretty deep knowledge of the underlying stories to see some of those accuracies play out on the screen.
Yeah, as you say, Vannevar Bush, who's played by Matthew Modine. I mean, all these people are played by very good actors, but you really do kind of have to bring some additional knowledge to pick up on what's going on. Another one who has a lot of play in the movie is Robbie, right? Who's another Jewish scientist. I mean, you get the kind of Eastern European versus old Jewish German tension, or whatever you want to call it, between him and Oppenheimer, right? But he's an important figure too. So it's really interesting. So many of these scientists in the movie, so much history that's there.
Yeah, if you're interested in the cast of characters for early Cold War science policy, I can't imagine another movie that will ever assemble such a cast of characters that will ever attempt to put all of these people on a screen together again.
So I would just go back to Strauss for a second, because in rewatching the film, I noticed just how central the preceding the congressional proceeding over Strauss's nomination by Eisenhower to be the Secretary of the Department of Commerce, how important that proceeding plays in the movie, right? It really kind of alternates between Oppenheimer's administrative hearing on the one hand, which is shot in color, and then the congressional hearing on Strauss's nomination, which is in black and white. Phil makes a lot of this hearing. I don't know how significant this was historically. One of the things that seemed noteworthy was that I think it's the American Federation of Scientists, or a large part of the scientific community, had kind of banded together to ultimately derail Strauss's nomination because of how Strauss treated Oppenheimer. What can you say about Strauss's hearing and its importance, relationship to the themes in the movie?
So the fact that Strauss was not confirmed in a position, he had been acting Secretary of Commerce, that was fairly unusual to not win a confirmation. I mean, at that time, it was just unusual for someone not to get confirmed in the first place. But given that he had been acting secretary and a man of his prominence who had led the AEC for so long, there's no question, it was absolutely humiliating for Strauss. Now, yes, the Federation of American Scientists opposed him, and what happened with Oppenheimer was absolutely a large part of why they opposed him. But it's also important to acknowledge something that wasn't really discussed much in the film, that the Federation of American Scientists in particular, many of them had been involved with the bomb. They were also absolutely outraged by the ways that Strauss had handled the fallout controversy, the question about the dangers of fallout, and particularly the fallout related to the Castle Bravo test in 1954 that were happening at the same time as the Oppenheimer hearings. So the scientists who had been involved with the atomic project had a lot of concerns about Lewis Strauss that went back to his original opposition to the international control of atomic energy. It was not solely limited to Oppenheimer, although certainly his treatment of Oppenheimer was a huge part of that, and I think made many scientists more personally invested in Strauss's humiliation than they might otherwise have been. But many of them felt that his advice had been actively dangerous to American security, and questions about nuclear testing had taken on a different political valence. I believe that there was actually a nuclear testing moratorium in place during the time of Strauss's confirmation hearing. His role in claiming that fallout was harmless were having dramatic international repercussions that were damaging the United States' credibility. And atomic scientists had more authority to make that claim than almost any other group.
So it was tied up with Oppenheimer as well as his kind of continuing positions and his view on testing.
Absolutely.
It's a fascinating character. I mean, for people to learn about the era, but also learn about the kind of Lewis Strauss figure. One of the many, many takeaways from the film, maybe a little more trivial note, is Robert Downey Jr. was so good, and kind of realizing how many other great films he could have been in if he hadn't been Iron Man. But he's just such a good actor. I thought he was.
He was terrific as Lewis Strauss, just absolutely terrific. He really inhabited that man.
Yeah, he really did. One of the things that struck me also in doing the research for the podcast was how long the trial transcript remained classified, the transcript of the security hearing. It wasn't until Obama made public hundreds of pages that had been declassified from the secret hearing. Why did it take so long to learn or for these documents to be declassified about the proceeding?
Well, as a national security scholar yourself, you know probably even better than I do that one speculates at one's own peril as to the logic of what is and isn't declassified. And then when it comes to the history of DOE documents, and for listeners who aren't familiar with the specifics of this, the Department of Energy is the successor institution for the Atomic Energy Commission. Carter changed this in the 70s. So the DOE took over all of the AEC's responsibility, which is why the DOE holds responsibility for declassifying matters related to Oppenheimer and other issues in the history of the bomb. But, it's the short answer is sometimes it's specific words. The most obvious answer is if there are things in it that are embarrassing to the government, that they try to keep those held closely for as long as possible. When it comes to atomic weaponry, the policies are different than in many other areas of policy. There's a fabulous book by Alex Wellerstein called Restricted Data: The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States, that really talks about how classification policy is bound up with the history of atomic weaponry. It's a fascinating book. So that's part of it. But also, a lot of it is just arbitrary. I cannot overstate how arbitrary declassification procedures are. When I was working on my second book, I requested some items go back for another review. And these weren't from the DOE, they were from various other government agencies. These were boxes that had been cleared in 2008. And there were still documents that had withdrawal slips at the archives that I requested to be declassified. And I eventually got most of them, in some cases as late as, in some cases it took 10 years, but I did eventually get most of them. And some of them you can see why they were probably still classified. It seems maybe sensitive in terms of how the United States was collecting intelligence. In general, matters related to intelligence operations can be classified indefinitely, even if it's something that happened 70 years ago. But other times there really do seem to be trigger words. Like one of the documents concerned plans for a exhibit that NASA was going to have at a World's Fair in Japan, a completely innocuous document, but it included the language of psychological warfare, that the poster would be an important part of NASA's psychological warfare operations. And presumably, somebody, even in 2008, thought that it would be damaging to release the idea that the United States had psychological warfare policies. So I hope this isn't a surprise to any of these listeners to know that the United States had psychological warfare strategies during the Cold War, but I hate to tell you, the United States did. And that involved even agencies like NASA.
Yeah, we covered it on another podcast, so at least listeners of this podcast will know. But I agree. You can speculate only at your peril about the mystery behind why things both become classified and remain classified long after the fact. Well, just moving to kind of the legacy questions before we wrap up. There have been a number of dramatizations of Oppenheimer, and particularly the proceeding for the theater, for film, for television. I mean, in some way, this is kind of introducing Oppenheimer to a new generation and reminding other people of it in a really very powerful film. Do you see any impact for the film on Oppenheimer's legacy?
I think it may be too early to say. I think that many viewers probably won't be as familiar with his legacy. That, when I was in grad school 25 years ago as a historian of science, and everybody was talking about the authority of the scientists, that's how I got into this topic in general. The question of physicists' authority and levels of independence was really front and center at that literature. And a lot of that literature has moved on since then, in part because many of the actors died. Many of them didn't die until the 1990s or the aughts. And I think with the passing of that generation, historians have been able to have other and perhaps in some ways more productive conversations about scientists' individual responsibility and or capabilities during the Cold War. But I thought the movie did such a good job in highlighting the limits of scientists' agency, in some ways even better than the book that it's based on. I think American Prometheus, which was published in, I believe in 2005, is still very invested in this idea that Oppenheimer and some of those around him had special knowledge that maybe should have given them special roles in the government, and that he was deeply and particularly wronged by Strauss in this way. And yes, I don't want to undersell the extent to which Strauss personally wronged Oppenheimer, because he did. But with some hindsight and with some distance, we can see the ways that scientists were telling themselves some pretty limited stories about their responsibilities and power, and the ways that they were being used in supporting these ideas of freedom. As somebody who's written about the ways that Americans confused and got wrapped up ideas about science and democracy and freedom, Oppenheimer's subsequent participation in the Congress of Cultural Freedom works. I still can't quite wrap my head around that. That here was a man who was going out trying to represent and foster discussions about science and democracy and the nature of freedom, even as he's J. Robert Oppenheimer. So he's a man without a clearance, but in some ways, the fact that he wasn't in jail was very, that in itself was telling, and something that the Americans could send him out on an international stage, as a symbol that there was a possibility for dissent in the United States. There might be consequences for that dissent, but the consequences might be losing your clearance. It wasn't being sent to a gulag.
Just to reflect on that in terms of the moment we're at now, and in terms of the role of science coming out of the pandemic, where there were a lot of kind of interesting questions raised about science and power in the government, the rise of and possible re-rise of Donald Trump, and increasing tensions with China, and some of the policies that have been directed towards scientists working in that area. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on how the film might speak to some current issues.
Very well, actually, because I think the film does a good job at communicating the idea that we need scientists' insights, that there are things that can't be done without expertise, that expertise is essential to national security, but also to kind of other parts of running a government. In some ways, the optimism that they're talking about in the 30s is related to this idea that you need expertise to accomplish various kinds of goals. And I think the film actually does a pretty good job at suggesting that scientists then aren't the only ones who get to make those decisions. That in a democracy, we have elected representatives, we elect people, and they are the ones who are often ultimately making decisions. It is not the scientists who have been appointed to a panel. They can make recommendations. And certainly this is a theme that came up a lot during COVID. The recommendations based on science for what you can do might not be the same as the recommendations that a population will live with.
One thing hopefully coming out of this movie that people will see, and I don't know if you agree, is the significance of science, even in all its complications.
Absolutely. And particularly, I would say the specific kind of science that they're talking about, the science of atomic weaponry, it's not something that we think much about until we have to. I think that most Americans aren't thinking about nuclear weapons on a regular basis. They're not thinking about the chain of command. They're not thinking about what to do with aging nuclear stockpiles. And whatever else one can say about the movie's use of Einstein, ending the movie really focusing on Einstein reflecting on what scientists had done in choosing to develop the weapon is incredibly powerful. And it is essential that we continue to have a debate about what to do about nuclear weapons, that the world is not safe with nuclear weapons in them. This is not a conversation that comes up often, particularly in movies that might be winning an Oscar. So I think for it to have that conversation front and center is itself an enormous service. And I hope we continue to talk about what are the role of nuclear weapons in national security.
It's such a popular movie. When people saw it, it does sort of re-raise that issue because I don't know if you're like myself, but I certainly remember when nuclear weapons was a dominant kind of political issue, but it really has kind of dropped off the general radar, right? When people think about security and war and conflict, but they're still there.
One consequence of the partial test ban treaty is that most nuclear weapon testing does happen underground these days. Not everybody tests their nuclear weapons underground, but the number of people who have seen a live nuclear explosion has dwindled, considerably since 1963. And I think there are some dangers associated with that.
So final important question, Audra, and another fascinating thing around the movie was the fact that it was paired with Barbie in terms of the experience, the Barbenheimer phenomenon. Did you see Barbie at the same time as Oppenheimer? Or did you just reserve your day for Oppenheimer?
I saw them on separate days. I saw them within a week of each other. I didn't partially have the stamina to do a 6-hour, but I also wanted to give both movies its due course. And the perennial Barbenheimer question of which one you see first, I honestly could not solve. And so I thought, I want to give each of these movies appropriate space in which I can enjoy and reflect on each of them. But they're both great. You should go see both of them if you haven't already.
The same as you, and there's probably no right, wrong answer on which one goes first, but I'm glad I saw them separately. Well, I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been great to chat with you about Oppenheimer, about science, about nuclear weapons, and all these other issues.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.